fifth grade. Really ain't no difference if that nigga gay.
Blood Satellite.
I got to power through this book that I read because I didn't love it, and a lot of people aren't going to like that I read this, but it was kind of building off of the Rousseau book that we discussed a while ago about inequality, discourse on inequality. And this is from another very famous leftist thinker. I don't know, he will get grouped in with a lot of different political movements, but the name of Michel Foucault.
Oh, yeah.
Michel had a standard upper-class education. He went to elite Jesuit institutions, was an altar boy, and his parents hoped he would become a doctor. But Michel wasn't quite like other boys. He started self-harming and thinking constantly of suicide. At university, he decorated his bedroom with images of torture by Goya. When he was 22, he tried to commit suicide and was forced by his father, against his will, to see France's most famous psychiatrist, Jean Delay, at the Hôpital Sainte-Anne in Paris. The doctor wisely diagnosed that a lot of Michel's distress came from having to keep his homosexuality, and in particular his interest in extreme sadomasochism, away from a censorious society. Gradually, Foucault entered the underground gay scene in France, fell in love with a drug dealer, and then took up with a transvestite.
Holy shit.
Hear Foucault a lot. This book was Madness and Civilization. Some people call it his masterpiece. Madness and Civilization, A History of Insanity in the Age of Reason. So I picked this up, and it was tied very closely with a discourse on inequality. And I find that we've read a lot of leftist and Marxist and progressive material before, including anarchist and anarcho-communism as well. And I might have given this preamble before, but I'll just say it again, that when it comes to these thinkers and these intellectuals, I tend to like where they start. So with most of the Marxist stuff I've read, they usually start with a premise that is novel, and usually a lot of people aren't talking about. Like even with Marx, when he was discussing from an almost ontological perspective, this idea of the surplus. And even when we talked about George Bataille with the accursed share, like he started with kind of an idea of like, what is this idea of extra energy? This idea, like, is that a universal or natural constant? And that's kind of where he was starting with. He takes it off into all kinds of weird shit about human sacrifice and whatnot. But that's kind of the case with a lot of these guys, where they start with noticing something important that a lot of, I love people on the right. I love, thinkers that are conservative and fascist and whatever, but sometimes they miss a lot of this stuff because they're trying to get too ontological, too philosophical, too spiritual about things. So like with a lot of these guys, this book, Madness and Civilization, started with a premise that I found interesting. And it was, what is the history of madness? And what is the history of how society treats the insane? Now that's interesting because on the right, we like to just ignore the insane. We're very eugenicist about things. Like, you're insane, we just say you're broken, go away, die, or don't, I don't care, just go away, right? But it is kind of interesting to consider, like, oh, we've had this idea of being insane and being mentally unwell. What is the history of that in the Western world? Because it seems that people will correctly identify that we have a very, very overreactive opinion on mental health right now, right? And the way we treat mental illness now is way different than we did in the 60s, but it's also way different than we did in like the 1800s and the 1700s. And how has that changed over time and why? And I'd never really heard that asked before. Like, that's interesting. And so now I find that this book has the problem that a lot of these leftist thinkers have, which is they play very fast and loose with history. Now, I like that. I think it's got a bit of a creative flair to it. George Bataille in The Accursed Share, and he was talking about all kinds of shit. He's talking about the Aztecs. He's talking about, ancient fucking tribes of aboriginals that didn't have, none of this was recorded, but it's like, this is what they probably did. Even Slavoj Zizek, he's always borrowing from history, and he's just grabbing anecdotes over the course of centuries and smashing them together like blocks. There's a certain energy to that, but that's the problem, where as these works go on, I distrust more and more the accuracy of their historical appraisal. However, I still want to talk about it because it's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
So all he says is, okay, let's look at the history of how we treated madness. And so he goes way, way back into European history, and he says, really, it starts with leprosy. He says that the leprosy epidemic in Europe and the rise of what were called Lazar houses, Lazar houses, to exclude the diseased. You know, we had the leprosy was a big deal. We had the disease. We learned that we got to keep them away and make a entire segregated part of society, which was a novel idea. You know, before that, you know, disease wasn't treated as much in that systemic way. Even during the Black Plague, it wasn't, you know, as much. But then leprosy is interesting because leprosy also rots your mind, right? Leprosy kind of makes you go crazy. So he said we start seeing the beginnings of associating insanity with disease. And there's interesting cases where what they used to do with lepers also, along with the colonies, was they used to ship them away to the colonies, these Lazar houses. So you'd have a village or a town and you just get away. So this was the birth of what they called the ship of fools. They used to just put them on a ship and sail them to wherever they had to go. So the idea of a ship of fools was directly influenced by these just like ship of insane lepers that were like sailing up and down. But still, there was this joining of insanity, treating insanity like a disease, or at least in their minds likening insanity to physical. Whereas all throughout history, insanity was often seen as its own thing, or was seen as a spiritual corruption. But here, you know, the course of this book is going to show how they kind of become one and the same. But this is kind of how it started. And you would just kind of send them adrift. You didn't really hate them. You just wanted them gone. And then all the villages and towns would empty them out. And they became this almost like wandering nomadic class. You know, of just these people. Where do you go? Well, you go where you live with diseased people now. And it's weird to think that, you know, they didn't do that in Rome. They didn't do that throughout human history. It's kind of a new thing. And he says at the end of the Middle Ages, we start to see a rise in literature about madness. So not only are we seeing it more, people are talking about it more. They're talking about this thing called madness in a way that hadn't really been evident throughout the written history that we had exposure to. Before, it was all about madness was just like anti-Christian values and sin. You never saw madness really talked about side by side with sin. It was almost just seen as extreme sin or extreme spiritual rot. And then it slowly decouples from that. And then as that happens, it begins to change over time too. And you start seeing the rise of madness and folly as the worst vice or sin. So, and as the primary vehicle of the Antichrist, that's how you start to see it. So they start saying that, oh, you're mad because of some moral failing. You made a deal with the devil. You've indulged too much in vice and sin that's rotted your mind, and the mind like your body, but you rotted it, you know, and that makes you sort of a vehicle for the Antichrist. And that's kind of like, you know, the biggest sinner is someone who just gave in. And so you start seeing this is the birth of madness as almost excess knowledge. You know, you waded too far into the unknown, into the darkness. You read too many weird books. You wished for too many things, and now you went insane by it. And so, you know, conversely, if you didn't want to go insane, you shouldn't get to, you know, wander off the reservation, as it were, and start looking into things you shouldn't look into. So it's almost like madness is your mind being infected with like evil stuff. And so you just got to not be exposed to that. That's how they started viewing madness there. But still, it becomes like a virus. Whereas before, it was just almost random. You know, it was just, oh, like you were born with it like you'd be born with like a stump leg. You're just like, oh, you're just a guy who's crazy. But now it's like, oh my God, I can contract madness. I can get it by doing something. You know, that's now you start to see the development of that. And then in the 17th century, 1656 specifically, you start to see the shift from madness as like a wandering thing to something that needs to be confined. And this is what they start seeing with disease too. So rather than someone being diseased, they just kick them out of the village. Opinions start to shift, and there's a great many reasons why this happened. One of it's because as power centralizes, you don't want just these people wandering around. So we got to build a place for them, and they need to be confined there. We can't have sick people wandering the forest or on a ship of fools or just hanging out on an island. We need a place. We put them, and they're not allowed to leave. And that's where you start seeing that. And you start seeing these pop up in Paris a lot.
Somewhere in the 16th century forward, 16th century, 17th century, into the early 18th century, there's a period of what he calls the Great Confinement. This is a period when the early modern cities are constructing general hospitals or hospital generals, poorhouses, workhouses, jails, prisons, as places to confine those who threaten to disrupt the social order. The primary people confined during the Great Confinement were the poor, the migrants, and the unemployed. But the mad, the mentally ill, were swept up with them. So these were generalized, unclassified spaces of a holding tank in the middle of early modern cities.
But even at this time, the lines between what is like a mental illness versus what is your mind rotting from disease versus what is just like a peculiarity, these are all kind of the same thing. They can't really delineate between these things. They just know, like, oh, you're crazy, we got to put you in a prison for crazy people. And even then, like back at this time, the idea of having a prison for like long-term criminals that didn't really exist. If you were a murderer, they would just kill you, right? They'd kick you out or they'd kill you. The idea of like, we're going to keep you in this prison for 50 years would seem like a crazy idea to a lot of the Middle Ages people. It's just like, and then we pay for it? What? But the idea, this new idea of like, oh, we're just going to keep them there for the rest of their lives was a new idea at that time. And he says that the phenomena of confinement coincided with the 30 Years' War. And he blames this on economic turmoil. So really, what he's trying to get out with this book, I'll just say this now, is he's trying to take a swing at this idea of social confinement. He's like an anti-prison guy. He's like, why do we live in a society where we have so many people in prison? So really, he's tracking the history of madness. What he's trying to do is make an anti-prison sort of thing. And then so he will tie it directly to economics too. So he's saying, oh, it's economically advantageous to have these people there because they can provide free labor. And he outright says that in the book. Now that may be true. I'm not going to say that wasn't true because he doesn't really cite a lot of primary sources as far as I can tell, but that I could see that. So he says that the phenomenon of confinement coincided with the 30 Years' War and economic turmoil. He claims that confinement was an answer to falling wages and other problems. So what he means by that is that around the 30 Years' War, you had a lot of people who were homeless and vagabonds. So you had people in the streets, and they didn't know what to do with them. And so what they started doing was condemning idleness. And he uses that word very specifically, idleness. And so idleness itself was then seen as a mental illness. You're a guy who doesn't want to work. You just want to hang out. Maybe got PTSD. They didn't have a name for that then, but you have that. You must go to jail. If you're just like a war veteran in the street and didn't want to go back to the fucking mill, you're like, well, you have this mental illness called idleness. And so we're going to put you here and you're going to work for free now. And the prisons were used to house people during times of crisis, and then in normal times as a source of labor, is what he's saying. And then eventually housing just the vagabonds and homeless there fell out of fashion. So those very same prisons that sprung up a lot in Paris and in Britain, like you can chart the rise of these sorts of sort of independently owned prisons. Though it fell out of fashion, and then it just became to house the insane. And he's more making the case that we just started redefining what insanity was. So insanity, if you're in a town or a village, meant that you're a babbling, raving lunatic, or you're a disease. Like, you just literally cannot function in society. That's what insanity and madness used to be. You're a babbling freak. Then you see madness become, you're not living properly in society. Or you do it, but you got a bad attitude. Or, you know what I mean? Like, or you're doing the wrong thing. But that's only a crazy person would do that. So that's the broadening of the definition of madness we start to see over time. And he kind of blames the Catholics. So he doesn't blame economics, right? He says the insistence of the idle and insane, the insistence that they should be able to work, came out of morality rather than economic demand. So he says that was the Catholic Church saying doing some work will set you free shit.
Since Adam and Eve's fall, God has punished humans with the necessity for work. Being unable to work was both a sign of vice and a threat to the stability of the bourgeois order. The mad, along with the idle, the deviant, the poor, were confined then as being unreasonable. But historian Roy Porter has criticised Foucault by saying that this picture of indiscriminate confinement does not seem to accurately match what actually happened in England. Few lunatics, he says, were kept in gaols, and workhouse superintendents resisted their admission.
And he juxtaposes this against the past. So he says, and I like this part, this was so cool, where he said, traditionally, in the ancient world and leading up to this time, evil had to be brought into public and dealt with in a ritual, right? So if someone is crazy, things that were negatively impacting society needed to be dealt with in the public square. So if there was a murderer even, or someone just losing their mind, it needed to be dealt with publicly, almost as a way to cleanse the community. But he had said that now it could all be done in secret or purposefully kept from the public. And that's one of those paradigm shifts that I think is so interesting. Like, you shift from the towns and the villages of the ancient world where everything was dealt with here, but now there's this new idea where we deal with things in the shadows, or you send them away to a place that's still, you're still aware that they're there. You didn't exile them. They're not really exiled. They're captive in a corner. And that's like on a much larger scale. That's a new idea that didn't exist before. He says madness in the classical age takes its form only in the shadow of reason, as almost like anti-reason or unreason. So here, and by the classical world, he means like the 1500s and 1600s. So as we start, this is kind of like an Enlightenment era thing. As we start to develop this thing called reason, then we start casting insanity as anti-reason. That, it's just reason is good. This is everything that negates that. It's the shadow of that. And he says here, the unreasonable becomes something to be gawked at, almost as inhuman, which makes sense that as we start to define ourselves more through rationality, and more through that sort of utilitarianism that we began to adopt in the West, anything that's against that is not only anti-reason, but if we define ourselves by reason, they're just like not us. They're like a different species entirely. And that's when you start like being obsessed with them. And so over the course of the book, he's also charting our growing obsession with the insane. I think the one example he gives was the Marquis de Sade.
At 24, Sade was put on surveillance by the police, who noted, "It wouldn't be long before we hear again about the horrors of the Count of Sade." These horrors would occur just 4 years later, when Sade offered work as a maid to a widowed beggar. When they arrived at his rented cottage, he attached her to a bed and started whipping her violently. He then slashed her skin to pour hot wax in the open wounds. All the while, the Marquis masturbated while threatening to kill her if she stopped screaming. When he was finally done, he forced her to do blasphemous acts during Easter Sunday before confining her in the room while he visited some prostitutes. However, his victim escaped through a window and roused the the village against him. The resulting scandal forged the Marquis's less than desirable reputation, yet his status and connections meant he received nothing more than a slap on the wrist, as his in-laws paid off the victim.
You know, like these guys who make a name for themselves as being insane. And if you look no further than the modern world and how many people are obsessed with serial killers, you know, like they are seen as like a different species than us, but we're so fascinated by it. But it makes you wonder, like, where did that distance come from? You know, like someone who's clearly mentally ill, but that fascination that's caused by the distance between it. That's kind of what he's talking about right here. How did that distance form? You know, and he claims, and this is the part I don't agree with. So I'll say this up front too. What he's also trying to say is that because we treat them as inhuman, they become inhuman. So he's doing that whole liberal thing where, you know, you send someone to a prison, they're going to become a criminal. I'm like, I don't really agree with that. He's saying that we send them to these chambers and they become animalistic. You know, he's kind of showing his political hand there. But there is something to it where they were kind of learning as they went what to do with crazy people. And so he talks about, like, over time, so you have these prisons where you're housing the mentally ill, but then within those prisons, they had to start delineating between different types of mental illness. So again, you have this thing where you have the regular, like, pickpockets and then insane people and then insane murderers, all the same. So they start redefining different types of madness. And that's where asylums come from. They grow out of prisons because even within the prisons around, even though they've kind of criminalized madness, they realize that they need special prisons for the mad because they can't exist with other criminals. So you make an entire new branch of imprisonment, which is the asylum, which now has its own rules too. So you're actually treating them arguably worse than criminals because they have less freedom there. But you get there by degrees. And, you know, the first asylums weren't even that long ago. We don't really have them anymore. And depending on who you ask, that's good or bad, you know. And that's what he says, you know, the 18th century, you know, this is the point of madness that's far from medicine. Like, it's not even seen as a medical thing. It's just seen as almost evil thing. There's no cure for madness. You just get it from being like a sinner piece of shit, and we just need to sequester you. So that's why in his mind, they were permitted to be treated brutally. Now, people can go back and forth about that however much they want, but that's the claim being made here. He goes in depth in the book about how this classical age treated insanity, and I don't think I have the time to go through it now. It's kind of annoying to go through it, about how they started developing this conceptualization of what's going on in the mind. Like, for example, they says, they start in the classical age, the definition of madness evolved to be a duality between what is essentially unhinged passion and profound unreason. So if you're crazy, that just means like you were so passionate you can't control yourself, and there's like it's like a conflict between the body and soul, or profound unreason, like you're just unreasonable to such an extreme. And then the way they treated that was like three different forms. And they thought that it's called the awakening, the return to the immediate, and theatrical representation. This is like the beginning of psychology. But then they broke down madness into all these different names. There's melancholia. It's like you're mentally unwell, but you're really depressive. Then there's different types of mania, and different types of mania were described as warm or dry because they thought there were these sort of essence fluids in the human body, and they're not wrong, but they said like, oh, there's, you know, when you're angry you kind of feel hot. That must mean that there's this hot fluid inside of you that kind of excretes from your organs to make you mad. So like, if you're just a madman, you must have too much of this fluid inside of you. And they gave names to it. So they were trying to like discover the chemistry of the mind. Now, again, they're not completely wrong because they just didn't know about serotonin yet. They didn't know about sort of the synapses and the actual fluids that control happiness and depressiveness and whatnot. But they thought it like came from your guts and just floated up through your head. So he goes a lot in that in the book and what they thought caused madness. I'm not going to waste, but it's not waste. It's interesting stuff if you're into psychology, but we'll go on for another hour talking about how men of the classical age thought depression worked versus mania, and there was like the big five, you're crazy or one of these five, and he gives credit to Freud because he says, and I do believe this, he had said what Freud was responsible for and psychoanalysis was bringing dialogue with unreason back into the fold, because at that point madness as a concept was adrift. It wasn't really spiritual anymore. It wasn't really moral. People didn't know what it was, because at least in the old world, they could say it's like a spiritual corruption. Now they didn't scientifically understand it, but they also didn't spiritually understand it as well. Freud brought it back as like a representation of unreason, but that could be reasoned with, because that's all. He likes this. I'm not sure I like it, but what he's essentially saying is that Freud and psychoanalysis meant that unreasonable people could be reasoned with, but they need to be reasoned with in specific ways. So arguably what he's saying is you need to either gaslight them or trick them or basically rewire their brain to think correctly. And that is essentially what we see with modern psychology and psychoanalysis. But I think that the movement was a bit better, because prior to that, we were just taking people, designating them as insane, changing what constituted that designation, and locking them up in hell boxes for a while. So as bad as it is now, I mean, imagine you were just thrown into a prison for the insane because you just had PTSD. That's a much worse fate, I think.
Yeah.
And then there's a period, like I said, where insanity, because of this, because of the dialogue and because of it being seen as kind of this unknown thing, becomes attractive to people. And I think that's where we are right now socially. Again, it goes back to the Marquis de Sade and him describing the various debaucheries that go on inside the prison. People being able to peek into the asylum becomes cool. That's what we're doing right now. We don't want to be there, but we want to be able to peek into the madhouse. We want our Silence of the Lambs. We want to watch Mindhunter. We want to like gawk at them. So it's that gawking that's just so interesting. And that's kind of what he's trying to get at with this book, about what caused that fucking gawking, instead of what it used to be, which was get the fuck away from me. Originally because you're diseased, but then just because you're evil, and then just because you're unreasonable. Get away. But now it's this like this twisted fucking relationship we have with the insane, but then also the expansion of everyone who is insane. Because now, in the flash forward to now, snap back to reality, it seems like 60% of the people in North America are insane by their own admission.
Yes.
So that's another thing too, the normalization of it. And he really ends the book, and we could stop it here because I know you have to get going, but really near the end of the book, he lets his ideology blossom, and his critique upon not only the history of madness, but imprisonment itself. So by the end of the book, he's saying that the asylum is a religion, it's a grand leveling, it's moral uniformity, it's recognition by mirror and perpetual judgment. So he's taking almost like the prison as society critiquing itself, but I might not agree with his conclusions, but I think for a lot of the listeners, yourself as well, like we might not like Foucault's opinion on, whether or not madness even exists, but the idea that we've watched the development of imprisonment over time. I think there's a lot of anarchists who would find that interesting. I think there's a lot of even people with maybe leftist priors who find it interesting. Like if you hate cops, this is it for you, right? This is all the story of how over time the centralization of power made it so that we created this entire class of this hybrid of the, because even now, look around, anyone who's a criminal gets automatically labeled insane. Isn't that interesting? That's the political argument being made every single day right now, that if you commit crimes, if you're crazy, that's only because of socioeconomic reasons. If you do crime, it's because you're mentally unwell. So it seems that they're making mental unwellness not a crime by saying it is only crime. You see, like, the sleight of hand that's going on here? Like, mental illness in this world is only tethered to crime. And for that reason, we should legalize crime. It's like the final form of this transformation. You know what I mean? Where, like, then society itself becomes the prison, because you've convinced everyone that they're insane and they need help. And the only thing that can help you is psychoanalysis in a confined space. And like we had said before, how do they treat the crazy? It hasn't really changed. You're employing theater. You're confronting them with realities they're uncomfortable with. Like, what psychoanalysis does is it breaks you down. It breaks you down right to the fucking roots of your being and tries to rebuild you again. So all that's happened is the prison has expanded for all of society, and now everybody is in it.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, he said, like, psychoanalysis. What was it? He's got this line here, and I'm not sure exactly what it means, but I think about it sometimes. He says, psychoanalysis doubled the absolute observation of the watcher with the endless monologue of the watched. So you describe, like, the interplay of, like, you're always being watched and you're always talking to the watcher as this, like, new fucked up relationship between the patient and the psychologist. That's what Freud give back. That is unreason interfacing with reason constantly, and there's no end point. There's no real way you can tell when they're cured. You can only tell when they're fixed. So now imagine that as the entire society, just the constant dialogue between the watcher and the constant monologue between the person being watched. And then as long as that conversation is going on, they think that is the cure. And you can almost never stop the conversation. So that's like a whole different power dynamic if they've convinced you that you're insane. Anyway, I'm going off into the weeds here. I know you got to get, you're sick, your sound doesn't work. We're all dying.
No, that's good stuff, though. I appreciate you actually reading Foucault. I don't think Foucault is honestly so far gone. I think to some large extent he's co-opted by the left. I know you can argue that he's a left-winger, but with a lot of stuff, when they're that far back, I don't think it's always fair to say, oh, he was clearly a socialist, he was clearly a left-winger. He did have a lot of interesting ideas, and I don't think he should be thrown out. So,
well, the guys like him are usually good at identifying the problems in society. And for my money, even guys who get pinned as being Marxist, they're some of the best critiques of modernity. Like, some of my favorite stuff has been, like, they're critiquing the Industrial Revolution. They hate Marvel movies. They hate all this shit.
You just don't always want to listen to their prescriptions. That's all.
That's it. Their prescriptions is like, and that's why we shouldn't have thoughts, you know. Or I don't even know what Zizek wants to advocate for, like weird sexual. You get it, like strange sexual stuff. But otherwise, like, I like the starting points, and they seem to be the ones like who take a let me see how many notes there are on this. I don't think there's a huge. Yeah, there's not a huge like index or glossary in here. But anyway, I read this I was about to hate Foucault, but I liked this book. I think there's a lot in here that people could look into, and maybe if they don't like the ending, they can at least take, I think, 45% of this and maybe go off in their own direction if they wanted to. Maybe they quibble over the exact assessment of the histories, or maybe they say, oh, we should broaden the scope to Asia, whatever, and Africa and South America, whatever. But I was more impressed by this than I thought. I might not like his other stuff, but this one I liked quite a bit.
Do not let the rapists win. Listen and love Blood Satellite.